Gonna get that countershaft bearing replaced here on the secondary clutch. So I've seen a couple different ways of guys doing it, and usually it involves building a really long puller with these big pieces of ready rod to go down to your bearing separator. I don't have enough pieces to do that, to rig that up, and I can't get, the clutch is too big to put in a hydraulic press. Like, this doesn't fit into the bed plate of the press to press it out, or else that's what I'd do. So instead, what I'm gonna do is I got 2 chunks of angle iron underneath the bearing separator underneath that's holding onto the bearing there, and I'll just be putting a 2x4 on top of here and pounding it off like this. Shouldn't hurt anything. I'm not going to get too crazy with the force on it. I've got it sitting on the hoist here, on the wheel adapter for the hoist, so I've got a good solid base for it for the bars to support it. But before I start hitting it, I'm gonna heat it up with a Bernzomatic torch here. Get that bearing fairly hot. Apparently Skidoo recommends a sleeve retaining compound. I know that stuff can really hold the bearing on a shaft. So I'm just gonna heat it up here, and I'll give it a few hits with the hammer once I get her nice and warm. And hopefully that'll pop right off. Once it's off that, there's a raised area that holds the bearing on the shaft where the bearing seats. Once you get it moved probably ½ an inch, then it should just slide right off the shaft, because the shaft gets smaller, of course, after that. Kind of a pain, but while I've got it apart, now's the time. I might as well change it. And you can see too the pathetic amount of grease that's put in new bearings. When I get the bearing off, I'll take the seal out of the other side and show you. I'll be greasing the new bearing that goes on as well. It's coming slowly. There she blows. No damage to the end of the shaft doing it that way. Ooh, that's toasty. That's warm. And you can see there's no grease in that bearing. I could have been re-greased, but while I got it apart, I'd rather just change it out. So I just put a box of paper towels down there for the clutch to land on. Don't forget to do that if you use this technique. So at the cost of a couple 2x4 blocks here, got her off. Let's take a look at the shaft. So I'll have to clean this up a little bit. It's cooled down enough now to touch it. So I'm not crazy. It doesn't look like there was any thread retaining compound on there. Really not a fan of using that stuff because it just makes it so much harder to get the bearing off. What I think I'm gonna do is just use a drift, like a brass drift to put the new bearing. I'll heat the new bearing up and put it on with a brass drift. There's the old one. It was smooth, and like I say, I could have repacked it with grease and put the seal back in, but I'm a little skeptical when a bearing gets, you can see how it's got a little bit, it's had some condensation in there, a little bit of rust. A bearing gets that dry of grease, I'm pretty skeptical of re-greasing it and using it. It's probably living its last days. Let's do a little comparison here. Here's the bearing I took out. Looks like it got some moisture in there. It's a little bit rough, but I also heated it up and beat it up. Let's look at the new bearing. So SKF, supposed to be a good quality bearing. There's the part number if you need to order one. I got this one from Napa, obviously. Pried the seal out, and look at that. Pretty much zero grease in that bearing. That is absolutely pathetic. This bearing is not cheap either. I found too that SKF is making these seals a lot harder to get out, and I did. You can see I kind of marked it there where I took it out. I just used the gasket pick. I'm not worried about that. I mean, look at this bearing. It's worth damaging the seal a little bit to get some grease in there, because it's going to last as long as I own the sled. If that one lasted 4,600K, this one's going to last until I'm done with this sled or using it for a backup or selling it. But I just wanted to show you guys, have seen on my other videos that I always grease seal bearings before I put them on. But this is the worst one I've seen. There is basically no grease in there. They probably squirted a little bit of oil on it, and I can even see, if you look close, where there's a little bit of moisture in there, which is even that much more egregious of them to do. So anyway, for the price of this bearing, that's absolutely pathetic. So I'm gonna be greasing this up with one of my favorite bearing greases, which is gonna be Metalon. Pop the seal back in, and then I'm gonna heat it up and put it back on the shaft. I might cool this shaft, at least put it outside. It's still just below zero out there today, so probably be doing that. I'm also gonna replace my Torx bits right now too. Pardon me, Torx bolts here with metric bolts. So I found a piece of pipe here that I cut. It's just a little bit, it's right around the same size, same inside diameter. That'll work just right to get this back on. Otherwise, I would have just used a brass punch and just carefully tap the bearing in, but it is pretty tight. I could, technically, I guess I could use the press to do this, but it takes a while to drop the bed and get the right length and everything. And I think that it'll be just fine tapping it on. If I got to give it an extra nudge, I'll use the press. So I'm just going to warm up the bearing, not get it super hot. Of course, you can't heat a sealed bearing up very much because you'll melt the grease out, melt the seals. You don't want to damage the seals, but you can just get it warm. That heat's going to transfer around the steel, of course, and it's going to just get it warm enough so it's going to expand slightly. And the grease and the ball bearings are going to insulate it from being too much of a heat sink on the counter there. I had an induction heater, of course I could use that, but I don't, so I'm just going to get it warm with the torch. Just that little bit, every little bit helps. I'm also not going to use the sleeve retaining compound on this because it just makes it too ignorant to get the bearing back off. You ever have to go back in and replace the bearing? Now that I've greased this bearing, it should be fine. It should have a really long life. What they're worried about with the sleeve retaining compound is their crappy bearing that has no grease in it seizes up and starts turning on the shaft, and then you've got to get a new jack shaft. That I'm not worried about. Jack shafts come up. Guys are parting sleds out all the time. It's not a super uncommon part to try to get if that was to happen, but I'm not worried about it because I greased this bearing up with high quality synthetic grease, and it's probably going to last longer than the engine in the sled. So by then it'll probably be a part sled if it comes to that. Anyway, that's what I'm doing, so just warm that up. I think that's fine. I'm seeing the grease start to get kind of liquid, so that's as far as I'm going to go with that. Okay, grab the clutch. This is cool. It's not 40 below or anything. It's not like dry ice. So I'm going to bearing slid on to where it's going to be going home. And just cheap insurance, I like to take the old bearing, put it on top of there. pipe on. And I'm just going to use the pipe. Using the pipe like a slide hammer, and look at that. All the way home. I didn't even have to hit it with a hammer.